So, Mouthwashing. I've been waiting for this game ever since I played Wrong Organ's previous game, How Fish is Made. It was featured on my Flash Games video, and just like that game, Mouthwashing is pretty short and plot heavy. There's not that much to discuss in terms of gameplay, so I have to go the analysis route. That way, I have to make the same disclaimer as with How Fish is Made. This video will contain spoilers for the entire game, so if you're at least somewhat curious about the game, I recommend experiencing it for yourself first. To add to that, I must warn that Mouthwashing includes a lot of serious and uncomfortable themes, such as murder, suicide, substance abuse, and sexual assault. If you're not comfortable listening to any of these being discussed, this is your cue. Alright, so I'm thinking I'll start with a more broad view of the game first, and then we'll move to a deeper plot analysis, because there's no turning back after that. To simplify the premise of Mouthwashing to the very basics, it's basically a story about space long-haul truckers. Imagine the regular truckers. Their whole job is sort of mindless, sitting in one place and driving, transporting cargo that holds absolutely no meaning for them. For truckers at least, the job can be somewhat enjoyable due to the ever-changing scenery, but ultimately I imagine it might get pretty lonely, being constantly separated from their close ones. Now, Mouthwashing is a sci-fi horror drama. Instead of a truck, we've got a spaceship floating through the outer space. It needs an entire crew to operate it, and the trip takes more than an entire year. There's no changes in scenery, or even more basic things like food, making the trip a lot more mundane. On top of that, having multiple people locked in close quarters for a month can already breed animosity between them. Even good friends can become real tired of one another. Multiply that to many more months, and you got yourself some guaranteed drama. When it comes to gameplay, Mouthwashing is pretty simple. If you played any PS1 style horror games, you know the drill. It's essentially a first-person point-and-click, but it does have some minor switch-ups sprinkled in. The simplicity is a non-issue though, because the game is mostly plot-driven, and with its 2 to 3 hour runtime, it feels more like an interactive film. It does have a great presentation though. I'm not necessarily big into the PS1 style, but Mouthwashing really delivers in that department with its great art direction. Just the design of the ship strikes so many points. The corridors are all claustrophobic and reminiscent of a submarine. The living room is kitschy in an almost dehumanizing way only a corporation could make. There are barely any different rooms, so the crew is bound to always run into each other. The whole ship has no windows to look out into the space. All you see are the steel walls, driving the feeling of claustrophobia even further. The closest equivalent is a large screen in the living room that shows the sun during the day and the moon during the night. And you'd be fully in the right calling me weird, but despite all that, I find the look of the ship cozy in a peculiar way. I'm personally not a huge fan of sci-fi, and the common futuristic bright white and chrome look of spaceships is mighty ugly to me. I'm also a big fan of the industrial genre, whether it's the music or the grungy visuals that accompany it. Rusty metal and darkness are my jam. The corridors in the spaceship are supposed to feel unwelcoming with the bare metal pipes winding everywhere and the metal grating floor, but the dim warm lights and the fact that the ship doesn't look super sterile, quite the opposite actually, makes it feel like a place I would gladly hang out at. Maybe not live for over a year, but just chill for a couple hours at a time. I also absolutely love the way Mouthwashing's visuals are stylized. Sure, you've got the usual low-poly 3D models, but the game also has an excellent pixelation effect, and I'd say that's something that's deceptively tricky to do right. I've touched upon this subject in my Dread Illusion review, which also had a pixelation filter, which was optional, but made the game look better in my opinion. It was quite different looking though. Dread Illusion's pixelation looked almost blurry, possibly due to the smaller size of pixels. I had also covered a game called Golden Light in my search for the weirdest games ever, and that also had a pixelation filter, but I remember that one feeling almost overwhelming at first, possibly because it felt almost too pixelated. Just the size of the pixelation is tricky to nail, but I think Mouthwashing did it. How Fish is made already looked great in that regard, but I think Mouthwashing perfected the look even further. It also rocks a limited color palette, which helps make convincing dithering shaders, which I absolutely love. With those on, the pixels look sharp and crunchy in the best way possible. Mouthwashing also excels at surreal imagery, with some mind-bending effects and sequences. Its use of data motion looking transitions is excellent. In fact, the chapter transitions would really get me. Every time a sequence ends, the game halts, emulating a crash. Now I have this terribly slow HDD that tends to make games stutter when they load something in, and that was very close effect to the real stutters, so several of the first times that happened, I really thought it was my computer screaming in agony. The more dreamlike bits are wonderfully composed both in terms of visuals and audio. The overall soundtrack is quite great, but there were some ear-piercingly distorted sound effects that stuck out to me particularly, reminding me of a certain butt-clenchingly uncomfortable shot from Mitch the Killer. Overall, while playing Mouthwashing, I felt like I could compare to something like Enter the Void. They both feel like surreal audiovisual masterpieces, and both tackle very uncomfortable subjects. Only when Enter the Void made me feel nauseated, and I don't think I ever want to rewatch it, despite it still being good. I'm still here talking about Mouthwashing, so I guess it's not quite as gut-wrenching. When it comes to the cast, we've got 5 people, and I'd say all of them feel sufficiently human and characterized as well as the short runtime allowed them to be. There's Anya, a squeamish nurse who still very much struggles with her duties since she hasn't passed an actual med school. Swansea is a middle-aged mechanic with a rough attitude who also happens to be a recovering alcoholic. Then Daisuke is a last-minute addition intern helping out Swansea. Daisuke is someone who hasn't ever been good at anything and still struggles to find his path in his young adult years, but who has put on his brave face and tries to do his best and get along with everyone. Curly is the captain of the ship. He seems like an overall nice guy, but has also got the crushing responsibility to maintain the ship and the crew in order. Despite being alright at his job, he's not entirely satisfied with it and is afraid that he might be stuck in this position for life. And then there's the main protagonist, Jimmy, who is, well, mostly an asshole. He's on the ship thanks to Curly due to them being buddies, but it's also alluded that Jimmy might be an ex-convict, or at least has done some nasty stuff in the past. I also want to praise how visually distinct and memorable each character is despite bearing fairly simple looking designs. Curly especially is so iconic, he practically became a mascot for the game. Anyway, this kind of cast of flawed human beings is like dynamite waiting to be detonated in such an isolated environment. So let's start digging into the plot. I will at least attempt to avoid the common YouTuber pitfall at just reciting the plot and calling it an analysis by adding my thoughts and conclusions. That being said, let's go over a quick plot summary first, because the game is originally presented in a non-linear manner to emphasize certain twists, or take the advantage of what information is or isn't known. And it might be useful even to those who have played the game to refresh their memories and have the events laid down in order. So, the game begins with this whole convoluted sequence of the player having to crash the spaceship into an asteroid. The way it's presented makes it look like a very much deliberate, self-destructive action. And without any context at that point, it's natural to assume it's the captain that did it. From that point on, the chapters are titled by the time they take either before or after the crash. The earliest the game goes is 7 days before the crash, as the crew are undergoing psych evaluations. Anya complains about Jimmy not being very cooperative, so Curly volunteers to do the evaluation himself. As they wrap up the evaluation, a letter from Pony Express, the company the crew are working for, comes in saying that the company is shutting down, meaning that as soon as the shipment is finished, the crew will no longer have jobs. The next day the crew organizes a birthday party for Curly, but feeling crushed by the news, he announces the company's closure to the crew despite the letter instructing not to do it until way later to keep morale up. A day before the crash, Curly finds his gun to be missing. It being the only gun on the ship meant only for emergencies. He finds out that it was Anya who hid it. Anya, being in a state of panic, confesses that she is pregnant from Jimmy, and that instead of using the gun herself, she hid it so at least Jimmy couldn't get to it. Her being so terrified of Jimmy and his earlier uncooperativeness seriously implies the pregnancy being a result of sexual assault. The day of the crash was the day Anya broke the news about the pregnancy to Jimmy himself. Even after that, Captain Curly has been fairly passive about confronting Jimmy about this crime. Jimmy, now knowing he lost his job and committed a serious crime that has undeniable evidence, fell out of control and decided to just end it all by crashing the ship. Curly only realized what he allowed to happen when it was too late. He was the last person in the cockpit that received the bulk of the damage and ended up as pretty much a glorified meatloaf without skin, limbs, the ability to do or say anything. 2 months after the crash, the crew started running short on supplies, both food and oxygen. By their calculations, it wouldn't last until the end of the trip, so they decided to check what cargo they're even shipping, in case it's anything useful. Turns out that the entire cargo is just thousands upon thousands of boxes of mouthwash. With this kind of impossible scenario, Swansea is quick to succumb and start drinking the mouthwash, as it has a decent amount of alcohol content. As the time goes on, things just keep spiraling for the worse, with more of the crew being drunk on mouthwash. 3 months in, Swansea and Anya are found talking in secret. It's not explicitly told what they were talking about, but it's fairly safe to assume that Anya confided in Swansea about the rape, from which point Swansea rarely lets go of a fire axe, now likely knowing what kind of person Jimmy is. 5 months after the crash, Anya locks herself in the medical room. Jimmy keeps desperately trying to fill Curly's shoes as a captain and tries to fix the situation by unlocking the medical room. He decides that the best way to get there is through a vent from the utility room that Swansea is keeping under lockdown, because it was damaged by the crash. In order to get past Swansea, Jimmy spikes his drink with isopropyl. After getting into the utility room, Jimmy and Daisuke find that the room hasn't been damaged as badly as Swansea claimed, and that there's still one operational cryostasis pod that he kept secret. The vent Jimmy was planning to go through was obviously unsafe and full of exposed sparking wires, so he made Daisuke crawl instead. Daisuke managed to get through and unlock the medical room, but got severely injured in the process. Jimmy and Swansea end up looking for anything to disinfect Daisuke's wounds, but since they were low on medical supplies and Jimmy used up the isopropyl to spike Swansea's drink, Jimmy resorted to using the mouthwash instead, which only made things worse. After several hours, Swansea mercy kills Daisuke, seeing that he is suffering greatly and won't get any better. Anya is also found dead in the medical room, having committed suicide by overdosing on painkillers. At this point, Jimmy's unreliable mind goes into full-on madness and it becomes increasingly difficult to tell what's real, but Jimmy and Swansea get into a conflict, resulting in Jimmy shooting Swansea dead. Jimmy and Curly are the only 2 left alive. Jimmy deludes himself into still trying to make things right and puts Curly into the cryopod, and since there's no hope left, Jimmy shoots himself, and that's the end of the game. Now with the plot summed up in a quick manner, with a lot of smaller details omitted, it is time to get deep and nasty into it. The game has 2 core messages. One is about corporate greed. It's pretty much a satire of how insane the corporate world can get and how little it values the human component. The workers get completely dehumanized and devalued just for the sake of maximizing profits. The second one, which is a whole lot tougher to discuss, is about the realities of sexual assault, the way the offenders act and get enabled, while the victims are powerless to do anything about it. The corporate greed part is a little easier to unravel. We all have heard the horror tales of how poorly Amazon treats its employees, and Pony Express is basically a glorified space version of it. The work they offer is pretty horrible. Even if the conditions were decent, being stuck in just a couple of rooms with the same several people for such long periods of time is no fun. Having to maintain both the ship and their sanity in the isolation for over a year takes serious effort, but Pony Express seemed to only employ bottom of the barrel people who have nowhere else to turn, so they could be paid the smallest amount possible. The crew of the ship don't have much other options than to work there. Anya had spent all of her money trying to get through med school, unsuccessfully, and now is trying to save up some cash to try again. Daisuke is not even a proper worker, he's just an unskilled intern, and I'm not even sure if I paid one at that. Swansea, as I said before, is a recovering alcoholic, and Jimmy hasn't had a chance at any other job either. Curly, as the captain, is the only one who isn't entirely down on his luck, although even he isn't too fond of working for Pony Express, because there's no more room for growth for him. He might just be stuck there forever. Overall, it's tough work with not so great payment, but the conditions are not great either. The workers are only allowed 5 hours of sleep per day, and medical expenses are deducted from personal credits. Late deliveries result in pay cuts. Complaints to HR may result in collective punishments. On top of all these restrictions, the captain is held directly responsible for anything that happens in the ship. Even if it's someone else's fault, the captain is considered to not have kept that person in check. So there are constant threats of penalties and overall a huge responsibility. During the game it's also revealed that Pony Express is the last company of its kind to still use people in their ships. It's a job that could be fully automated, but they're just too stingy to invest into some technology and keep exploiting poor people. One detail in the very beginning struck to me particularly. When steering the ship to crash to the asteroid, the autopilot detects the obstacle ahead, turns on to avoid the crash, and immediately deducts credits from the pilot's payment. It shows that the autopilot could pretty much just be on the whole time instead of using a human pilot, and that the company is very willing to take any chance to pay their already low-paid employees even less. Finally, just the fact that the crew is shipping thousands of crates containing nothing but mouthwash implies that Pony Express values the mouthwash more than the well-being of the crew, since all the tough terms and restrictions are all for the sake of transporting the goods. The poor conditions and the constant pressure to not make any mistakes plays a huge role in the downfall of the crew's mental health, but we'll discuss the specific cases as we move forward. Now, sexual assault is a topic that's a lot harder to talk about, and I hope I don't do too bad of a job of it. It would really suck otherwise. At least the game doesn't have an outright rape scene. It isn't explicitly stated, but it's very strongly implied. The earliest sign in the timeline is Anya doing the psych evaluations and Jimmy being problematic during it. He jokingly said that he was getting aroused at the sight of cartoon horses, which is a jab at constantly having to see the Pony Express mascot, but assuming that the sexual assault already happened at this point, any sexual remarks are understandably uncomfortable and very insensitive. Even the lack of cooperation aside, it's understandable why Anya wouldn't want to do Jimmy's psych evaluations herself anymore. 2 days before the crash, which is just before Anya starts breaking down and hides the gun, Curly and her have a conversation, in which Anya first asks how much of the trip is still left, most likely to gauge whether she would have to give birth on the ship or not, and the answer is she would. Then she also asks the captain how come most places in the ship, like the medical room, the utility room or the cockpit, have locks, but not the sleeping quarters. For safety, Curly answers, and that answer couldn't be more bitter. With the player's knowledge at the time of the scene, it's firstly a jab at Pony Express on how it values the replaceable equipment and inventory more than their employees. But knowing what really happened, the question becomes a lot less random. With no locks in the sleeping quarters, Anya doesn't have a place to feel safe from Jimmy, and that's the only place the sexual assault could have taken place without anyone else noticing. Even after the crash, there are details like Anya being the only one not to start drinking the mouthwash due to its alcohol content. Keep in mind that at the time the pregnancy is not a known fact yet, due to the game's non-linear presentation. Her struggling to feed Curly the painkillers could be also seen as a consequence of her trauma. Of course, it is simply unpleasant having to perform medical procedures on a person who is so badly mutilated, but it can be viewed in a way that Anya finds Curly in a similar position of a victim, and feeding him the painkillers while not letting him die might be something against his will, since that is prolonging his suffering, and he cannot say anything about it. Anya hiding the gun from Jimmy is only the final nail in the coffin. It must have taken her some time to realize she's pregnant, and when she did, she also understood that now there's irrefutable proof of what Jimmy did to her, and she's almost more afraid of what Jimmy might do after finding out about such proof rather than the original crime. I'd also add that to me it feels like just implying the sexual assault through various clues is the way better choice than showing it explicitly, because not only it feels more tasteful, but to the people who are not directly involved, that's exactly how it is. It is a hard topic to talk about openly due to various reasons, and people usually need to pick up on the clues or take the victim's word for granted, yet that doesn't always go as smoothly as it should. With it being clear that a case of sexual assault did take place on the ship, I'd like to address a criticism I had encountered about the game that I think is pretty fair. I mentioned how every character feels very human and well characterized, or at least as much as the short runtime allows, but Anya, who feels like a central character in the story, is the one who is characterized the least, and the great majority of her lines have something to do with the sexual assault, whether directly or not. Even the secondary characters have something going on. Daisuke has his Game Boy, Swansea is a sneaker enthusiast and has a swan charm, but Anya doesn't have even the smallest detail like that. Being a sexual assault victim is made to be nearly her entire essence, and I can see it being the case. There is an entire issue in media that sexual assault is very rarely depicted well. I'm a believer in free speech and that there is no topic that should be kept unspoken, but things concerning sexual assault are extremely difficult to talk about in a tasteful manner. After all, it's a crime considered worse than murder by many. It's often depicted in an awful and unnecessary manner just for the sake of character development. So then the question rises, if Mouthwashing depicted sexual assault well in this case or not, and after giving it some long thought, I still want to say that it's done well enough. Firstly, it's not just some secondary event for the sake of character development or anything like that. It's a central theme. Well, yes, if you take the sexual assault out of the story, Anya's character would suddenly lose her entire meaning, which does suck. But with the sexual assault out of the story, there's no story left. Second, and even more importantly in this case, we must not forget that the protagonist and the narrator of the story is Jimmy, who is not only the assaulter, but also a very unreliable narrator. Jimmy is a whole can of worms. He is possibly an ex-convict. This is implied in this conversation with Curly after finding out about the pregnancy, when he mentions that he's been through worse, and it's not easy to even think of what's worse than sexual assault. The way Jimmy spikes Swansea's drink by mixing isopropyl and mouthwash is also scary, because that's pretty much the recipe for chloroform. You didn't hear that from me, I only found out about it when researching things for this video. Jimmy knowing that makes his past sound even more dubious, and that might have been how he managed to sexually assault Anya too. Jimmy is only on the ship due to him being friends with the captain. He was also the one who reacted the worst to the news of Pony Express shutting down, because he has no other options. With him being out of his job, and there being irrefutable proof of him being a rapist, he was also facing time in prison as soon as he lands. Jimmy is not just a bad person, but he's a bad person who no longer has a future. It's that realization that drove him to crash the ship and take everyone else down with him. The interesting part is that right after steering for the asteroid, Jimmy is shown having a mental episode and seeing posters and mascots of Pony Express everywhere, blocking his way out. When he is looking for something to disinfect Daisuke's wounds with, there is this whole stealth section of Jimmy being chased by this terrifying invisible horse. Even this just about being sexually excited at the sight of cartoon horses shows that Pony Express is always on his mind. After Curly was incapacitated, Jimmy took his post as the co-pilot, meaning that all Curly's responsibility fell on him. Pony Express, always monitoring his every action, was consuming his mind. Eventually, when Jimmy started thinking about taking responsibility not only as a captain, but also as a person, he had this vision of him performing echoscopy on a giant pile of meat only to find horse fetuses. Then a centipede made out of pony mascot bursts out emulating birth, and Jimmy still did nothing but run away from it. Not only did he fail to take responsibility, he didn't see either Anya or the baby as humans. To him, it's just something that happened on a Pony Express ship, and something that Pony Express will punish him for. Throughout the game, Jimmy keeps saying that he'll fix things, while trying to fill Curly's shoes, no matter how bad the situation would be and how delusional it would sound. He would attempt to come through when it came to the other crew members, but he would only belittle Anya and treat her like a nuisance who is unable to do her job. At some points, it even seems like Anya is swooning for Jimmy, which might very well only be his perspective. I missed it on my own originally, but apparently in one of his final psychedelic moments, Jimmy was going through a corridor full of employee cards, the cards being the ones of the crew members, but none of them were Anya's. And then one of the hardest hitting moments for me was when Jimmy was looking for the disinfectant to help out injured Daisuke, and upon entering the medical room, Jimmy would just see a blank, data-mashed blob in place where Anya, freshly overdosed on painkillers, was lying dead. He cared so little about her that his brain would just refuse to acknowledge her presence. Even after the scene, he wouldn't even comment on her dead body. That not only shows that he is not taking responsibility for his crime, but he's also incredibly misogynistic and doesn't even see Anya like a human being worth dealing with. When the story is shown through the eyes of this kind of person, it makes complete sense that Anya would be a lot less characterized than her male co-workers. Jimmy just doesn't care to notice any of those details, and he would have to disregard her as a person in the first place to even commit to sexual assault. Also, don't get me wrong about saying that Jimmy at least tries to come through for the other characters. He's still an irredeemable bastard, and his attempts at fixing things are just a facade. He keeps trying to fill Curly's place, and taking responsibility by performing Curly's duties. He's attempting to take responsibility in the same way as Curly, as the captain, who is responsible for the whole ship and crew. Whatever issue there is, Jimmy keeps repeating that he can fix things. Even in situations as dire as Daisuke writhing in agony without there being anything to treat him with, Jimmy keeps being delusional by saying that the situation can be fixed. Not only is that promise of his untruthful, but it's straight up his way to evade his real responsibility and accepting the fact that all the bad things going on the ship are his fault in the first place. If anything, Jimmy would have been happy to just get away with his crime. After the psych evaluation, he just says that he likes it on the ship and that he feels in control. As long as there was no proof, he would have happily stayed his horrible self. The only morally correct choice of his was putting Curly into the last cryopod instead of himself in an act of self-sacrifice, but even that is not just a way to prolong Curly's suffering even further, but also an escape from his punishment for his crimes by just taking his own life instead. Now Curly is another puzzle piece to this whole mess. Even if he was feeling stuck in this position and wished he could keep going further in his life, he was good at his job as a captain and generally liked by the crew. One of his better qualities was also a part of his downfall. He would just try to see the best in people. He would be the first one Anya would tell about her pregnancy, and it was his duty not only as a captain, but also as a friend to confront Jimmy about it. But he kept delaying. That left Anya with only Daisuke, who severely lacked life experience and any authority, and Swansea, who is no giant of empathy himself. At least after Anya spoke with Swansea, it seemed like he was saving the cryopod for her and not for himself, as that was their only way not to give birth in the spaceship, showing that he's not that bad of a person. As Curly was going to do the psych evaluation on Jimmy, there was this entire anxiety-inducing psychedelic sequence full of warning signs. At first it can be just interpreted as late foreshadowing to the ship crash, but it can also be taken as warning signs about Jimmy as a person. Curly might have very well known that Jimmy was a disaster of a person, but he still chose to sweep all that under the rug, under the pretense that Jimmy is his close friend. Even during their confrontation, when Jimmy had just found out about the pregnancy, Curly was too lenient. Instead of punishing Jimmy somehow, locking him in the cryopod for later trial, he just let Jimmy off to crash the ship. A part of Curly just kept hoping that Jimmy is his friend, and this whole thing might just be a misunderstanding. Another part of him was worried about how punishing Jimmy would impact his career. At this point, Curly was already sick of his job, and really wanted to move on. Unlike the rest of the crew, the job at Pony Express wasn't dead end for him. Yet, if he were to mess up, if he was held responsible for allowing for something as terrible as a rape to happen on the ship, he would be heavily penalized. Overall, his inability to make the tough choice and serve justice made him an indirect accomplice to the crime. By knowing about the sexual assault and not doing anything about it, he was just enabling Jimmy and letting him get away with it. Then there's also the whole deal about a certain phrase that's repeated multiple times throughout the game. Our worst moments don't make us monsters. Their worst moments do not define people. While it sounds like an optimistic thing to say, Anya was the first one to say that. Despite what it might have sounded like in these specific circumstances, knowing the context, it sounds like she's trying to convince herself that maybe Jimmy isn't that bad of a person, that he's still redeemable. That's the one thing said by Anya that Jimmy seems to have internalized, and that's only to make himself feel better about his own actions. While thinking that, and telling that he can fix things, that he'll take responsibility, Jimmy just proceeds getting the entire crew killed. When there's no one else left, he sits down with Curly and proceeds to cannibalize his leg since there's no food left. The whole cannibalism thing might have been just another psychedelic moment, of which there are plenty in the game, but Jim is also shown feeding the meat back to Curly himself. Just like with the painkillers, he would extend Curly's life in exchange for even more suffering. And even with painkillers, it was more of a way for Jimmy to make the only person who knew about his crimes go silent, while relieving the pain was just a side effect. And that's the moment Jimmy breaks and decides it's time to end it. The madness. That it's time to get to the cryopod. It would seem like conscience is finally starting to get to him, that he'll finally accept his responsibility, yet he just shoves Curly into the cryopod and shoots himself. Which is the same thing he's been doing all along, prolonging Curly's misery and not facing the consequences himself. And if we were to go all the way back to the teaser to Mouthwashing, the next one and then another, there Curly says something very similar to the repeated phrase, but also quite different. He says, "We are defined by our past, but are not slaves to it." That would mean that yes, our worst moments contribute to who we are, but with effort, there might be redemption. Yet, still Jimmy failed to do that by continuously evading his responsibility and doing the same mistakes over and over again. And that's roughly my takeaways from Mouthwashing. It depicts sexual assault from the perspective of the assaulter, the way he thinks and makes excuses, the way an assaulter is enabled and can get away with his crime. And it is a story about how such a corporate greed-driven hellscape like the one Pony Express made dehumanizes people and can bring out the worst in them. I'm almost sure I'll think of more points I could have talked about in this video after I publish it and be mad about it, but that's your moment to shine in the comment section. There's even an entire theory that Curly didn't even survive the crash, and Jimmy is even more delusional than it seems, but I choose to ignore that one. Overall, I'd say Mouthwashing is a bit of a tough pill to swallow, especially when it comes to the discussion about whether using the topic of SA is a good choice or not, or if it's been done tasteful enough, but otherwise, it's a very well built and immersive experience. I love this presentation, from the perfectly done retro graphics to the mind-boggling psychedelic sequences. I liked its soundtrack and sound effects, and it's a story that kept me obsessed for a while after finishing it. I'd say it's well worth your time, and I hope this video has been too. Thank you so much for watching, I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll see you in another video.